Hall Gailey, for those of you who don't know me, and we're going to talk about how to read a poem. I've given a lot of talks, and I taught for 4 years, and I was read about the poet laureate, and I thought, I really talk more about writing poems than reading poems. So I hope this talk will be useful in how to read a poem. So the first thing I want to talk about is how not to read a poem, because a lot of people come from school with a certain preconception about what poetry is and how to read it, and meter and meaning and so forth, making it a bit of a chore. And that is what I do not want people to feel about poetry. So a poem, my first non-statement is, a poem is not an escape room. So it's not something you have to escape, figure out all the clues, maybe there's maybe a couple of exceptions. There are poets who like to write puzzle poems, but most poems are not puzzle boxes. They are pretty easy to comprehend, have some meaning, have some emotional weight to them, have some imagery, have some sonic devices, but basically it's like you'd listen to a song, you'd look at a piece of visual art. You either respond to it, and you think about how you respond to it, or you don't. It's not like, is this a good poem, is this a bad poem? Does this poem mean something that's hidden from me? No, just when you first read a poem, just try to appreciate the poem. That's my thing. The next thing is, poems are not autobiography. Some of them are, but they don't have to be. And a lot of poems are fiction. In fact, I would say 3/4 of my books are fictional poetry books. Becoming the Villainess and She Returns to the Floating World are all written in persona, which is a fiction writer's tool set, right? But poets can use it too. A poem does not have to be beautiful. It does not have to be truthful. It does not have to have a big message, but it should have something memorable or moving about it. So there are some people who think we should look to poetry for truth and beauty, and those are fine things, but every poem is not going to contain those things. And maybe it shouldn't, right? Maybe poems should be wider than that, in my opinion. Let's see. So one of my first things that my mom taught me when she was taking a poetry course in college, and I was a kid, she told me the first thing you should do with a poem is read it out loud. And in the old days, we used to memorize poems at school to learn something about them. So I used to do, when I was in 5th and 6th grade, I did a poetry recitation contest, and I really learned to memorize poems and hear what the poet was trying to say to us out loud. And it's a really wonderful way to kind of get nuances you might not get just in reading. And I think that's really an interesting thing about Louise Glick, who just recently passed away. She was not an entirely spectacular reader, but her poems are so accessible and moving, it didn't really matter, right? She wasn't a big performer, she wasn't Dylan Thomas, but it was so fun to hear her read with her inflections and her sense of humor and her pauses, you know what I mean? So here are some of the tools of the poet that you can look out for. Once again, this is not a game, it's not something you have to solve, just stuff you can look for. Images, pretty easy. Metaphors or similes. Language choices. So if they put a curse word in there, they put a word from another language. Those are choices, and you have to think about why those are in the poem. Punctuation, line breaks, tone, sonic devices like onomatopoeia, consonants, assonance, synesthesia, rhyme, meter, syllables, counts, iambic pentameter. All that stuff is just different ways to get sound into a poem. Emotional engine is something I had a professor named Dorian Locks who talked about what is the emotional engine of this poem. And I love the way she was making it mechanical. Like there's an engine behind a poem. And I've always loved that metaphor. So there's also usually a turn in a poem, so it can be about one thing. The poem is walking through the woods on a snowy evening, and suddenly he's thinking about death, right? There's usually a turn in a poem where it starts out with one thing, kind of moves into another subject. And then fiction tools, persona, setting, mood, and as you may have noticed in Louise Glick's Meadowlands, dialogue, right? She has a lot of dialogue poems in there. So the other thing is, when I was a professor, I told people not to read poems biographically, which means maybe you don't take into account who they are, where they're from, what their personal life was like. Because I think that's not really fair to the poem. The poem should be able to stand alone. But in person, I'll tell you, I think it's very helpful to read in context. I like to know when a poet was alive, who was famous while they were writing, who was the big thing, important details about their life. Sometimes that really, like for instance, Virginia Woolf was a really inaccessible writer to me. I didn't understand your work. But during the pandemic, I read all of her journals and her letters, and then I was able to read her fiction with more understanding. So context can be important. But I said, you know, we always read Sylvia Plath and people are like suicide, 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 right? But Sylvia was about more than just her suicide. She was mostly not about suicide, right? So I think it's important to think this poem stands alone, and also what was the world in which it was created. So that's it. That's my little talk.